The 93 children who lived at Santa Eulalia Orphanage, the church's cruelest charity. They say if you hold the old photo up to the light, if you look past the scratches and stains, you can count the children standing in rows. Small, fragile, barely more than shadows in gray uniforms. But look closer, past the blur, past the folds. Look at their faces. Not one of them is smiling. It's not just the absence of joy that unsettles. It's the silence their expressions imply. A long, bone, deep silence. Like they'd already seen the end of something. Like they'd been asked to carry it. And in the center of the photo, slightly taller than the rest, stands a woman in black. A nun, by all appearances, her hands folded neatly, her eyes cast downward. Her habit is pristine, her face, not quite visible, not blurry either, just wrong, as though the lens refused to focus on her. The photo was taken in 1924, just before the orphanage was shuttered. But the story of Santa Eulalia begins much earlier than that. The building was first erected in 1883 by the Archdiocese of Santa Fe. Officially, it was meant to be a home for children orphaned by disease, poverty, or the railroad, children of miners, ranch hands, and the newly displaced. But unofficially, the whispers were different. The land it was built on had a history, older than the Spanish, older than any church. The Mescalero avoided it, called it Esh, Tiona, which roughly translates to the place that waits. They said nothing grew right on that ground. Birds wouldn't nest in the trees nearby. Animals passed through but never stayed. No water pooled near the site. Even when it rained, the soil remained dry, as though the land drank only certain kinds of suffering. But to the church, the location was ideal, remote, high on a ridge, with space to expand. The structure was made of pale brick, shipped in piece by piece, with an iron bell tower and a crucifix so large it cast a shadow across the whole yard at dusk. Children began arriving in the winter of 1884, 17 at first. By 1890, the number had grown to 38. By 1905, it was over 70. And by 1923, when state officials finally investigated, there were 93, or so they claimed. The orphanage was run by the Sisters of Our Perpetual Mercy, a reclusive Carmelite order with few public ties. Records show the first Mother Superior was a woman named Sister Dominica Calero, born in Galicia, Spain, and sent to the American territories after a scandal in her former convent that was never explained. Under her rule, the orphanage thrived, at least on paper, but those who lived nearby told different stories. They said the bells rang at strange hours, midnight, 3 a.m., just before dawn. They said the children were only seen outside in uniform lines, never at play. They said if you passed the grounds in the dark, you could hear singing, high, brittle voices, all in unison, chanting something that didn't sound like Latin. The official motto of Santa Eulalia was Caritas Perdulorum, charity through suffering. The locals gave it a different name. The house that eats children. There were early signs, faint at first. A traveling tinker in 1891 claimed he'd seen the same girl 3 times in 3 years, same age, same face, standing in the same spot. A visiting priest in 1897 reported a persistent sense of dizziness and misplaced time after staying the night. He died of a cerebral hemorrhage 2 weeks later, but the church did nothing. Why would they? Enrollment was high, donations flowed, and the children never ran away, not once, not in nearly 50 years, because where would they go? The ridge was high and steep, with no road save a rutted ox path. The forest beyond was dense and hostile, and no one in the surrounding towns would take them in, not after what they'd heard. It wasn't until 1923, when a young state inspector named Marlo Ramirez was sent to investigate irregularities in census reports, that the true shape of the horror began to show itself. Ramirez was meticulous. He interviewed former donors, reviewed church financials, cross-referenced baptismal logs. But when he arrived at the orphanage itself, something changed. His handwriting grew erratic. His reports, once detailed and neat, became brief, unfocused. He noted strange things. Children do not blink. Dormitories colder than outside air. Eyes watching from bell tower. None stationed. His final note, scribbled on the back of a torn hymnal page. Read, the count is always 93, even if one dies, even if one is buried. The next morning, there are 93, He never submitted a final report. He vanished 2 days after his last visit. The church blamed exposure, said he got lost in the hills. But his boots were later found near the orphanage steps, and inside one boot, carefully folded, was a torn strip of black fabric from a nun's habit, singed at the edges. That winter a fire was reported at Santa Eulalia, but when fire crews arrived, the building stood untouched. Only the inside was scorched, furniture blackened, walls blistered, but the brick exterior and roof remained pristine. None of the children could be found, nor the sisters. The record stopped there. The building was abandoned, fenced off. Eventually, the church sold the land to a private party. Today, the orphanage is gone, leveled sometime in the 1950s under suspicious circumstances. But people still find things in the dirt: tiny shoes, rosary beads with teeth marks, bits of porcelain dolls buried deep, their faces cracked wide in expressions too detailed for the time. And sometimes, when the wind rises, you can still hear bells ringing from a tower that no longer stands. The land was quiet for almost a year. The building sat empty, watched only by wind and mountain shadow. No effort was made to reclaim it. No priest was reassigned. No sister sent in to assess damage. The church simply stopped speaking of Santa Eulalia. But in the spring of 1924, something changed. A pair of surveyors working for the State Highway Commission arrived on the property. Their goal was simple: assess the ridge for a proposed rail line connecting Espaola to the southern hills. Neither had ever heard of the orphanage. The structure, to them, was just an old brick ruin, marked faintly on their map. They arrived just after dawn and never returned to the inn they'd checked into the night before. When a search party was dispatched, the innkeeper led them up the ridge. He pointed out the path the men had taken, still visible in the early light, tracks in the frost. But as the group ascended, those prints abruptly ended, halfway between the trees and the orphanage fence. No sign of struggle, no animals nearby, no indication they had gone in any other direction. Just stopped. At the gates, the searchers found something even more disturbing. On the frost-covered ground were 93 shallow impressions, small feet, bare, no adult prints, no boots, and all of them pointed outward from the orphanage doors, like children had walked out to greet someone. Or something. The state closed the case within days. Lost in terrain, the report read. Possibly mauled by cougar. But cougars don't erase boot prints. And they don't leave 93 barefoot tracks in the snow. Word reached the archdiocese within the month. A decision was made, quietly, and with no announcement, to retrieve the remaining documents from the site, not by clergy, but by archivists under strict instruction to report nothing publicly. One of those archivists was a man named Elias Dreher. His private journals, sealed for decades and rediscovered in 1982, paint the clearest picture we have of what still lingered inside Santa Eulalia. Dreher describes entering the orphanage on April 12, 1924. He notes that despite weathering and signs of fire, the structure was unusually preserved. He mentions an unnatural cold throughout the upper floors, even though spring was well underway. In the dormitories, he found the beds still made, each one with identical gray blankets tucked to the same degree. No dust, no cobwebs, nothing disturbed. On every pillow, a white cloth cross, neatly folded. He writes, "The building does not feel empty. It feels paused." In the central hallway, the one that connected the dorms to the chapel, Dreher discovered a set of framed photographs, class portraits, dated yearly from 1885 to 1923. Each image showed the same formation: children in rows, the Mother Superior at the center. But there was something deeply wrong with the last photo. Not just the expressions, though those were chilling enough. It was the count. Dreher writes, "I counted them again and again, 93 every time, but I noticed one detail. A boy in the third row, second from the right. His face was identical in the photos from 1919, 1921, 1922, and 1923. Same eyes, same mole beneath the left eye, same crook collar. Not a resemblance, the same child, unaged, unchanged." He removed the photo from its frame and found something scribbled on the back. Faint, as if scratched into the paper with a nail. "I do not forget. I do not forgive. I only count." Later in the chapel, Dreher found the church ledger sealed in wax and still legible birth names, baptismal dates, donation records. But next to each child's name was a date of death, crossed out, then written again, then crossed out. In some cases, up to 8 times. Some children had been reported dead, then alive, then dead again, over decades. As if no one could quite decide what had happened, or whether they had ever really left. But it was what Dreher found in the bell tower that led to his breakdown. He wrote only one sentence about it, a scrawl on the final page of his notebook. There was no bell, only a boy. He was waiting. That was the last Dreher ever spoke of Santa Eulalia. He was committed to a sanatorium 2 weeks later for hallucinatory psychosis brought on by stress and starvation. He never ate again, said the food smelled like prayers. He died 6 months later, weighing only 72 pounds, and even then, on his final day, he kept counting aloud, over and over, 93, 93, 93. After the death of Elias Dreher, the archdiocese did something it had not done in over 2 centuries. It invoked tacit silence, an ecclesiastical measure reserved only for the darkest stains on church history. All records concerning Santa Eulalia were sealed. Clergy who had served in the region were reassigned or quietly retired, and for a time, it seemed as if the orphanage and the 93 children who had never left it would simply vanish into oblivion. But silence has a weight, and in the small town of Arroyo de los Muertos, where the ridge was just visible through the dead trees, people began to feel that weight pressing in. It started with the children. A schoolteacher named Marta Negron reported that several of her students, ages 6 to 9, had begun speaking in unison during recess. Not playing, not arguing, just standing in a line by the fence, murmuring phrases she could not understand. When she drew closer, she realized they were reciting in Latin, poorly, but precisely. She asked them where they had learned it. One girl said it wasn't a lesson. It was a song they all heard in their sleep. The same month, townspeople began seeing strange lights on the ridge at night. Not fires, not torches, a pale blue glow, pulsing softly, like breath beneath a blanket. Others heard the bells, no longer loud but faint, as if from deep underground. And then came the dreams. Dozens of reports. Always the same: a long hallway lined with beds, children sleeping. A nun walking slowly between them, her shoes making no sound. And at the far end of the hallway, a boy standing with his back turned, whispering numbers. Each night, the number grew louder, always ending at 93, and always followed by waking in sweat, with the vague impression that something had been counted. Not the dreamer, but someone else, somewhere else, had noticed them. By autumn, Marta Negron herself disappeared. Her small house was found empty, the hearth cold, her front door open to the wind. On her desk, authorities found a piece of paper with a single sentence written over and over, line by line, front and back. It is not that they never left, it is that we let them in. The town changed after that. People stopped walking near the edge of the woods. Dogs refused to go beyond the eastern ridge. And in the church, Father Alvarez, once a cheerful man of robust health, began to wither. He spoke less, slept at the altar, and during confession, he began to say strange things, whispered things. To one penitent, he reportedly said, "She still walks. She counts her steps, one for each child." To another, they were not orphaned by war or plague. They were given. And finally, to the mayor's wife, who had begged him to bless the school. Blessings cannot undo bargains. He hung himself in the bell tower 3 days later. There was no bell, only the rope, only the sound of wood straining in time with the wind. In 1927, a private investigator named Raymond Knoll was hired by the widow of Elias Dreher. She had never accepted her husband's official cause of death. Claimed something had followed him back. Something that smelled of cold iron and old hymnals. Knoll was known for his discretion. He had worked in Chicago and New Orleans. He was not a man easily disturbed. He made it only 2 nights in Arroyo de los Muertos. His notes, found later, torn and stained, tell of strange voices outside his inn, not speaking but breathing. He described a shape he saw standing in the road just before dawn, a small boy barefoot, who vanished when Knoll approached. But his most chilling entry came on the 2nd night. They were not abandoned. They were exchanged. Given up. 93 hearts to feed one silence. That was the final page. His body was never found, but in his room, the mirror had been covered. A strip of paper was tacked over the glass. On it, the words, "Hay watches through reflections." Something had awakened in the ruins of Santa Eulalia. Not a ghost, not a curse, something colder, older, something that understood numbers the way a butcher understands weights. And once the counting began, it did not stop. By 1930, the church had bought out every property within 3 miles of the orphanage, not to preserve it, but to isolate it. The surrounding homes were torn down. The forests cut back, but the ridge remained, untouched. It was said by the locals that if you stood at its base at dusk, you could still hear footsteps above. Children's feet, marching in rhythm, 93 steps, then silence. The year was 1935 when the first real attempt was made to raise the orphanage. The archdiocese had changed leadership, younger men less bound by fear, eager to clean the bones of the past and restore the church's credibility in the American Southwest. A contractor out of Albuquerque was hired. No religious personnel were to be involved. The plan was simple: demolish the structure brick by brick, replace it with a cemetery, and erect a small monument acknowledging a place of former charity and tragedy. The funds were approved. The crews arrived. They lasted 2 days. The foreman, Victor Lomax, filed a single report before he disappeared. "There's something beneath the chapel floor. We broke through the slate tile by accident. Thought it was just foundation. But it's a stairwell, old stone. And it goes down farther than it should. I don't know how far. None of us want to check again. There's something wrong with the air. It feels like we're being counted, like our breath is being tabulated." They never returned to the site. Locals later said Lomax had been seen outside his motel at dawn, staring at the sun with his hands clutched over his ears, as if trying not to hear something beneath the soil. He left town that evening. A letter arrived 2 weeks later to the bishop's office, written in a frantic hand. "The stairwell does not go down. It goes back." Every step was an offering. The children were not victims. They were the ritual. And the boy is not the first. Nothing more was heard from Victor Lomax. The church made no further efforts to demolish the building. But it wasn't over. In 1939, a cryptographer named Dr. Gerard Howell obtained access to the sealed Santa Eulalia records through academic channels. He was studying patterns in ecclesiastical records, curious about how the church encoded trauma. He expected to find euphemisms for disease, buried terms for abuse, perhaps concealed deaths. What he found were numbers. Every report from the orphanage's 38-year operation included references to untake totals and childal presence. But the terms were vague. What disturbed Howell was that every month ended with the same line, repeated in Latin: "Stare numerum, serva numerum, niadas." Hold the number, keep the number, do not add. He translated hundreds of pages. The phrase never changed. Even in years where fires had broken out. Even during the 1911 outbreak, always 93. Even when a child died, another arrived within days. Sometimes the ink on the new entry was fresher than the death report. Howell made a breakthrough in the personal diary of Sister Carmen del Val. She had served there for 19 years before her disappearance in 1923. Her final entries were lucid, clear, and horrifying. "We are not caretakers. We are stewards of a number. Each morning we count, and each morning it must be 93. If it is not, the boy stands in the hall. He does not knock. He does not speak. He simply waits. One of the others will fall ill, or vanish, or walk into the woods, and then he goes away again. The number is restored, but never above 93. Never ever above." And then, the final line: "One girl arrived unrecorded, a foundling from the mountains. She made us 94. He screamed. We buried her in the root cellar before nightfall. I still hear her calling." The pattern was no longer a mystery. It was a ritual, a containment. A fragile wall built not of bricks, but of human lives held in perfect tension. And the boy. He was not a soul, not a ghost, not even perhaps human. He was the counter, the one who watched the ledger, who enforced the balance, and who punished deviation. In 1944, during a freak lightning storm, the chapel roof collapsed. A photographer from El Nuevo Heraldo was sent to document the ruin. His name was Mateo Prieto, and he was known for his stark architectural portraits. His photographs were published only once before being pulled by censors. One image stood out. It showed the crumbled sanctuary, the shattered altar, the warped crucifix, and standing in the background, in the shadows of the broken arch, was a small boy in period clothing, barefoot, smiling. The photo was analyzed, burned, then sealed. Prieto would not speak of it again. But 1 year later, he was institutionalized in Las Vegas, New Mexico, where he spent his remaining years scratching the number 93 into every surface he could find. Walls, windows, his own arms. He died without ever taking another photograph. There are other fragments, other stories. A pair of missionaries in 1947, found curled together in death, their faces twisted in mute terror, mouths filled with soil. A census taker in 1950 who walked into Santa Eulalia with a clipboard and walked out speaking only Latin, weeping whenever he heard the number 94. And always, at the heart of it, the boy. There is no resolution here, only memory, only the silent truth that no one dares speak aloud anymore. A final image, not to explain but to endure. In 1952, a series of fires swept through the forests west of Arroyo de los Muertos. It was a dry spring, and the winds carried flame with unnatural speed. The town barely survived, but something curious happened in the aftermath. The fire reached the base of the ridge and stopped. Not slowed, not redirected, stopped. Dead in a perfect, jagged line around the perimeter of the Santa Eulalia property. It was as if the flames remembered, as if they too feared what slept in the ruins. After that, the archdiocese fenced the land and posted signs in Latin, warnings, wards, not one word of Spanish or English, not a single name, just a number XC, and beneath it, ni adas. They never demolished the orphanage, not because they forgot, but because they remembered all too well what happened the last time someone tried to change the count. The building still stands, rotting, swallowed by vines in the thick hush of time. A place that should be forgotten but isn't. Because some things do not die, they wait. Because sometimes a number is not just a measure, it's a sentence. In 1963, an American folklorist named Elaine Bruckner visited Arroyo de los Muertos while researching regional ghost stories. She had never heard of Santa Eulalia before her arrival, but locals grew quiet when she mentioned the ridge. She was told, don't go up there. Don't ask about the children. And whatever you do, don't bring your own. She did not listen. She and her young son were seen walking up the path that spring morning. They were never seen again. A search party found her purse near the chapel door. Inside it was a notebook filled with observations, theories, and folk incantations. But the last page held only a single scribble, a child's handwriting. Too large, too uneven. One word, 94. And that, perhaps, is the cruelest thing about Santa Eulalia. Not the silence, not the secrecy, but the inevitability. It never ended. It was never about spirits or suffering. It was always about the count. A contract carved into flesh and stone and ash. A debt that must be paid in full forever. So if you ever find yourself traveling through northern New Mexico and you pass a town no longer marked on maps, if you see a trail winding up through the pines toward a sagging rooftop and rusted iron gates, turn around, leave, do not speak the name, do not follow the footsteps, and do not, under any circumstance, bring the number to 94, because the boy is still counting, and he never forgets.